Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 30th of August. It's going to be the final video for me of this month. We're going to look at a lot of important updates today from the past 3 to 4 days, starting off with numerous Russian advances along the border region between Dnipro, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia, including the capture of Komyshuvakha. We'll zoom in and get a clarification on what's going on in Pokrovsk and east of Murad, where there are intense battles ongoing. We're going to look at Russian troop redeployments. A lot of Russian forces from Sumy and Kherson have been redeployed to the Donetsk region. And I want to look at which specific units we're talking about, their size, and when they will get integrated into the front line. We're going to then zoom in on the battles north of Lyman, and we'll finish off with the Kupyansk front. So I'll keep this video brief, and I'm saying that without any sort of irony. I'm actually going to try to keep this condensed. But let's begin over here with Zaporizhzhia region. The Russian forces advancing north of Lysivka, taking advantage of the fact that there are gaping holes on the Ukrainian line and a lack of sufficient forces deployed to this region. That manifests with the capture of a lot of these open regions that are to the east of the Yanchur River Valley and south of the first line of defense that is supposed to protect the northern chunk of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. And furthermore, the Russian forces have captured all of the open fields directly south of Temorivka, where we had this outstretched Ukrainian pocket. It's now been closed, so about 5.5 kilometers worth of territory seized by the Russian side. In the process, it took over a lot of key tree lines and the eastern edge of the defensive fortifications. And again, based on the vector of attack, the Russian forces were able to seize these positions in a way in which the Ukrainians hadn't really built the defenses to absorb an attack through the eastern flank. You could see, based on the layout of the various layers of defense, whether it be the anti-tank ditch or the dragon's teeth or the minefields or the barbed wire or the trenches and dugouts themselves, they were built with the intention of absorbing an attack that would come from the south. And so even though it still has utility when enduring an attack from the east, it's not the same sort of effectiveness. So the Russian forces also took advantage of that dynamic and are now going to be able to travel from this sort of eastern direction and then hop one by one through all of these defensive fortifications. And the Ukrainians won't be able to utilize the defenses in a unified manner to the same degree that they would have had the Russians attacked across a broad front from the south. And so that's just some of the concern and some of the way in which the defenses over here have been rendered superfluous, but not entirely. Either way, what we can see over here is that there is some strengthening or sort of a reduction of the front line. A lot of these outstretched salients are getting closed because it's becoming difficult for the Ukrainians in small squads to retain control over a large perimeter and retain control of supply lines as well. And so now they're trying to condense the front line and try to, straighten it out over here. You can see that with the line from Bratny all the way to the south being rather straight, but the Russian side also has positions north of Volhivska that can upend that uneasy peace in the future and attack directly towards the Yanchur River. That's certainly a concern that I haven't seen mentioned enough, but it really should be stressed because the Russians are beginning to seize control over key heights that overlook the river valley and some of Ukraine's defensive possessions over here. So this is certainly a front to keep an eye out for because, again, the Ukrainian deployments over here are meager, to say the least. And there's also a possibility of the Russian forces also just beginning to target the defense line from the south in tandem and in parallel with the attacks that are currently unfolding to the east. But we have even more Russian activity around Komyshuvakha. This is more important to the Russians' current tactical goals. You could see that they're on the precipice of taking over the entirety of this southwestern corner of Donetsk Oblast. There's only a couple of open fields and anti-tank ditches remaining along the border with Dnipro, and they amount to over here 12.5 square kilometers. The Russian forces over the past couple of days have been able to seize 15.3 square kilometers of territory. And this has been done for the most part due to the efforts of the 57th Motorized Rifle Brigade. I know they're deployed somewhere over here. I just need to find their insignia. And so they're the ones that actually stormed Komyshuvakha. And according to Deep State, the attack happened from the south. But the video itself of the storming and of the flag raising indicated that the attacks came from the east. That's what they were claiming, at least these Russian sources in the video, that there was an eastern attack, I would say, based on organization points in Shevchenko, and then from there the forces branched out and assaulted the village, and it could be that in tandem there was also an assault coming in from the south. given the fact that the Russian forces from the 57th Brigade had just taken over Novoukrainka along the same general direction. And the loss of this village is significant because this acted as a glue for the rest of the Ukrainian footprint within this part of Donetsk Oblast and near the border with Dnipro, which allowed them to have outstretched positions, sometimes really deep into what would be imagined to be Russian-controlled territory. So you're looking at areas that were 4.5 kilometers south of the village, or perhaps 4.3 kilometers east of the village. And the only reason why they were able to maintain control over individual tree lines is because they had this narrow way back into Komyshuvakha, and then from there it was relatively stable in terms of connecting their forces to the rear with these various Ukrainian villages leading up to Veli Komykhailivka, which is the largest Ukrainian node of logistics and artillery in this region. But now that the village has been captured, just the dominoes that fall with it would be all of the nearby fields. It would simply be impossible for the Ukrainians to retain control of those positions given the fall of this important defensive node, which is also important because it's surrounded by fortifications. So those have also been overrun by the Russian side. So the video over here from August 30th shows that they cleared 100 houses and they claim to have destroyed a company-sized formation during the course of this battle. So it's possible to play with the definition and say that the battle has been going on for weeks as the Russians have been approaching it from open fields. And then you could call that the Battle of Komyshuvakha, and then destroyed, which is the language that the Russian sources always use when it comes to casualties. That implies that they were either killed or wounded. And so then, based on that, you can reach a company-sized formation, which also spans from about 100 soldiers to 250. So again, very broad definition. But yeah, I could see how during the course of those days, a company-sized formation would be engaged in the fighting over here, given some level of rotation. But the 57th Brigade is the one that ultimately took it over. And this means that there's another outstretched pocket that I do expect will be closed. And that will help, on one hand, try to reduce the front line, which is important for the Ukrainians because they simply are unable to account for every single square inch of the line of contact. But it also has the same effect on the Russian side, which allows them to concentrate their forces on, specific areas and try to penetrate over there. And they actually do have the manpower to do so. So you can see over here that the Russians, they are on the precipice of closing in on another roughly 20 square kilometer pocket of territory, which remains outstretched near the border region between Donetsk and Dnipro, and then from there arrive at the line from Voronezh to Ternove. And the Russians have already prepared for the next step when it comes to their offensive activities over here because they've been heavily bombarding the village of Berezhove. So keep an eye for that. But at the same time, what we've seen most recently is this Russian attempt, at least, to send DRGs to infiltrate into the village of Novoukrainka. So what I think happened here is that the 141st Mechanized Brigade focused their resources on the recapturing of Alexandrov, and then they ignored their southern flank. And so there was an opportunity for the Russian side from their forward positions in Voskresenka to send in several armored vehicles, cross over the border, and advance through this line of open fields and the nearby gully north of Sychneve, which apparently remains under Ukrainian control, but could be in a gray zone. And then from there, dismounted forces in Novoukrainka. This is what was reported on the 29th by Deep States. And there hasn't been much outside external information from the Russian side about this advance. And so that's why I'm very hesitant to change it, because it would be such a significant change if it were to be the case that the Russians actually were able to push from the border. And let's look at the extent of the advance if we're to be entertaining this. So you can see that it would be about 7 kilometers at most, nearly 8 kilometers to the Vavch River. So that would indicate that there is a hole in the Ukrainian line, that they're not necessarily manning some of these open fields. And it's not possible to do so at all times because, remember, it's pretty close to ground zero. Sychneve itself is dangerous, but that's an area where at the very least you could have a couple of squads that are accumulating forces in basements or bushes. But again, aerial activity on both sides is very active around here, especially within a 5-kilometer radius of the front line. And so there's an opportunity sometimes to just exploit an open gaping hole. And so that's something that's certainly possible. And it would go hand in hand with another claim by Deep State that there was a similar sort of advance that occurred along a very narrow route just south of Sychneve towards Novoukrainka as well, and around Voronezh. which we already know to be the case because we know that for Malivka, the Russians have been able to establish a footprint in eastern Voronezh. And that's a concern for the Ukrainians, not only because of what that means for the pockets to the south, but also because it can expand from there towards Sosnivka, and that's an important local hub for the Ukrainians. From there, it has access, this village, to a couple of other roads that branch out to the north or to the south, and then you could arrive pretty close to a lot of Ukraine's possessions near the southern or northern bank of the Vavch River. So there's a lot of room for exploitation over here and for malleability of the front line due to the fact that it's largely open and due to the fact that the Ukrainians have not deployed a sufficient amount of reinforcements to this southern part of the Dnipro front. The northern part of the Dnipro front is a bit different because there actually is a pretty strong deployment of Ukrainian forces, but we're not looking at that today. I want to zoom in though on Dachne because over here the Russian forces have nearly captured the entire town. There are a couple of holdouts near some of the outskirts or near warehouses, but for the most part, it's fallen into Russian hands. 0. 0.7 square kilometers taken in the process, and this is from August 27th. Just a video from the Ukrainian side of their FPV strikes onto the houses wherein the Russians were residing, and since then have expanded even further into the town. And again, this is just a consequence of the fact that there's been an overload of Russian assaults. And so we're talking about a very small surface area. So eventually, just due to the sheer brute force, the Russian forces have been able to take over most of the town. And at most, if we're being generous, it's 3.8 square kilometers in its size. And same thing with Kotline. The Russians have captured a couple of hectares over here in this residential part of the town. Again, this is an area that's been relatively static because it doesn't have much of a tactical bearing on what's going on in Pokrovsk directly. The Russians have not tried to really cut off the road to the E50 highway, even though it is about 5 kilometers away. They simply have committed forces elsewhere where they found the potential for an attack to be more, I suppose, viable than over here. But regardless, there are still large positional fights over here on a daily basis, and so the Russians have been able to slightly advance. But looking at the fighting in Pokrovsk, minor Russian advance to the west of Zhvirove, and the situation may actually be even more favorable to Russia than I'm depicting. Some Ukrainian sources claim that the Russians have, and this is not something that's new, but just something that I've noticed, is that they claim that the Russians have control over this line of ravines that then circles around this local quarry. So that's actually possible and would imply that the Russians are pretty close to this section of the T0406, although it doesn't really matter because this part of the highway isn't used by the Ukrainians because Kotlin is under Russian control. In any case, though, it would imply that they do have a bit of a wider base over here than I imagine. So I'll have to look into that. But I have made some adjustments to the map over here in Pokrovsk, and it's not something that's occurred over the past 3 days. In fact, the Ukrainian counterattacking efforts and the gradual dissipation of DRGs within the city has been going on since the early parts of August and then really reached zenith in mid-August. That's when the Ukrainians really were able to solidify control over much of the city, especially the city center around the Soborny Park. And then from there, advancing south of Shakhtarsky. There's infamously that video from August 26th of the 155th Mechanized Brigade sending in the Leopard 2A4 tank to engage Russian targets near Vulitsia Kievska. And then a couple of hours later, footage came out from the Rubicon drone units, and it's from this geolocation. I remember I marked it, that they destroyed it using several FPV drones. They destroyed the Leopard after it engaged in frontline clashes. And so the fact that it was even able to make it in the first place is pretty wild, and we don't see their deployment much nowadays. But it was used, and the video was released, and you could see the apartments from the Shakhtarsky microdistrict still standing and still being a defensive, formidable force. But regardless, the tank was eventually destroyed by Rubicon, and Rubicon is very active around here as a drone element. And at the same time, we do know that the Ukrainians have been able to reestablish control over much of the eastern part of the Kalinivka microdistrict, which is this southernmost microdistrict in Pokrovsk, this horizontal outstretching of just private residential areas just south of Shakhtarsky, actually. So I've estimated that around 3 square kilometers were retaken by the Ukrainians over the past, say, week. And that's in addition to the various changes that I marked before, wherein the gray zone around Jubilee Park and Troyanda had also fallen back into Ukrainian hands. But the western parts of Kievska Road is actually still under Russian control based on footage from the 155th Brigade of grenade drops on Russian forces over here. So we know they're still present in this area. They do still have a footprint. And there is some sort of back and forth fighting north of Donetsk. Some Ukrainian sources have the map as sort of splits around this pond region, but this is not necessarily the case. There are some Russian forces to the north from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade. They raised their flag over there recently, and in turn, they were targeted by FPVs from the 425th Skala Assault Regiment, which engaged in the fighting in Murnerhad, but was quickly returned to this area to fight and try to reclaim control over the remaining parts of Volitsia Zotova over here and try to re-enter Leontovichi. But for the time being, it still remains under Russian control. And now, due to the fact that it's been about a month since the Russian forces first seeped into this area, they've started to solidify control over large chunks of it. And that will mean that they can gradually build up a base over there. But in terms of expanding it, that's not within the sort of near-term field of vision. That's not necessarily what the Russian command is looking at over there. And at the same time, they don't even have the ability to, when you look at the Ukrainian defensive garrison and their commitment to defending the southern perimeter of Pokrovsk. But in turn, due to the redeployment of forces, for instance, the 68th Ager Brigade from Lysivka to Pokrovsk, it means that there have been some gaps found by the Russians elsewhere. So here we can see on August 28th, the 1st Battalion of the 68th Jaeger Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry in this tree line to the west of Lysivka, indicating that there was an advance by the Russians of about 1.4 kilometers northwards. And even though the trench isn't marked over here, there is an important defensive fortification just to the east of Novoukrainka, so that could potentially fall or can be enveloped. But we do know that about 0.7 square kilometers of territory were captured in the process, meaning that there is this strong Russian flank to the west of the village of Lysivka that can now be used to squeeze the Ukrainians out of the town. But again, the intensity of fighting over here, at least when it comes to ground engagements and ground movement, trying to break through, trying to push the respective sides out of a particular house, it's not that intense over here. It's obviously still extremely intense when it comes to the level of artillery shelling, fab strikes, and FPV strikes. But there has been a bit of a dying down of the fighting over here when it comes to ground movement and an acceptance of the status quo where the Ukrainians control these two roads in Lysivka. But perhaps, maybe not now, but in the future, this can be used as a base through which to change that situation. Now, a bit to the east, there are a couple of important changes as the Ukrainians did try to upend the Russian possessions along the Toretsk River, because you can see how the Toretsk River is very important to the local geography over here, spanning from Pankivka all the way to the south to Mykolaievka and even further southwards to Hordivka. And so the Ukrainian intention with their counterattack, organized by the Skala Regiment and the 79th Air Assault Brigade, was to break through, cut off the road that supplies the Russian forces that are engaged in fighting in Novoukrainka and Mykolaievka, and then from there, potentially, if there's a possibility, try to reach Kopyevka to just completely upend the Russian bridgehead to the west of the Toretsk River. That was the intention, but that was never a realistic proposition because in recent weeks, the 51st Combined Arms Army has completely redeployed their reserves and all of their forces to this region, to this roughly 60-kilometer part of the front line. And so they started to rapidly redeploy those reserves from the rear to the front line once it became clear that the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack in this area. So first they engaged in fighting in Malanivka, then in Mirny, and eventually pushed the Ukrainians back across this part of the Kazani-Toretsk River, basically between Mykolaievka and Myrolyubivka. And so at this point, I no longer consider this location, this polygon that spans 5.52 square kilometers, to be under Ukrainian control. I believe that the Russians from the 95th Motor Rifle Regiment, which is a part of the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, were the ones, this unit in particular, they were the ones to push the Ukrainians back and stabilize the front line along the floodplain. So now positional fighting continues within the southernmost parts or southernmost sections of Novoukrainka and Mykolaievka, with Mykolaievka being completely under Russian control, but the Ukrainians have made inroads into Novoukrainka, capturing 0.5 square kilometers of territory. This video from August 28th proves that, showing that the Russians conducted FPV strikes onto Ukrainian squads as they're moving from house to house, in this part of the town. And so the Ukrainians are trying to relegate the fighting to a populated area that is rather far away from Murad in relative terms. It's about 4 kilometers away. And the intention is to just keep the fighting there. And yes, there will be losses in the process, but then the Russians are completely fixated on that positional warfare. And it gives the Ukrainians time to beef up their frontal defenses, their defenses on the northern flank of Murad, for instance. It's just a way to divert attention. And that's something they've done numerous times in urban battles, trying to start a sort of diversionary clash in a nearby populated area. And so we're just seeing more of the same in that regard. And then over here, the Russian forces have just shored up positions to the west of the Toretsk River, including about 2 square kilometers north of Redeployment in largely open areas that probably the Ukrainians were unable to retain control over due to the difficulties in resupply and due to Russian aerial dominance over here. It was simply untenable to retain control due to high casualties, I would presume. And so they're just cutting back on their outstretched locations over here after months of fighting. And this probably has to do with the fact that the Russians recently tried to overrun the mine over here north of Redivka, which still remains a gray zone, but there is this advance to the north of the mine, 29 hectares, as the Russians control basically the entire perimeter of this reservoir region. But that's all for Murad and Pokrovsk. I do want to show you guys that there was a Russian advance in Rusin Yar amounting to 0.6 square kilometers of territory. This is from August 30th. The 3rd Battalion of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian positions west of, or in western Rusin Yar, rather. So most of the village has fallen into Russian hands. There does remain this notable pockets of Ukrainian resistance, which has to be clamped down on in order to fully change the dynamics on this part of the front line, because there are still some forces, I would assume, from the 111th and the 93rd and the 44th over here, all those brigades that are holed up in some tree lines and some dugouts in this cauldron. And the goal would be now for the Russians to use Russia as a base to fully cut them off and force them to withdraw. And then from there, take over the remaining parts of this anti-tank ditch, which still remains under Ukrainian control. You could see them marked in orange. Now, it appears as if a lot of the movement over here has ramped up, and there may be preparations for a attempt, and this is something we've highlighted for months, an attempt to push northwards and seize control over large swaths of open fields all the way up until an area like Mykolaiv, Pilia, and Roskinishny, Balka, Stepanivka, this entire area. It would play into the hands of what's going on in Yablonivka right now, with attempts to create a strong Russian base southwest of Konstantinivka, which can be used to attack towards the village, or the town, sorry. It's a pretty large town. But in any case, there's also the possibility of the Russians attacking directly northwards once they overrun the defensive line over here, which has been critical for the Ukrainians in preventing that from happening so far. And there are two lines. But the first one is more formidable. And then from that point, there were a couple of smaller ones that aren't necessarily the most unified, up until the line from the northwestern edge of Konstantinivka all the way to Torsk and Pryut. So we're looking at this span of territory, this region that from this front line up until the next unified line of defense is about 9 kilometers, depending on where you're measuring. It could be as much as, say, 11, 12 kilometers if you're being generous. And so this region is really exposed, even though the Ukrainians have redeployed forces over here in order to prevent such a nightmare scenario from occurring. But there is a possibility of the Russians now trying to attack directly northwards, seizing control over large swaths of open fields in the direction of Druskivka with the intention of undermining the logistics of Konstantinivka. That would be the goal. First and foremost, it would be to try to cut off the supply route between Druskivka and Konstantinivka. That would be the goal of such an attack. And then afterwards, once the battles in Konstantinivka come to a conclusion, it would give the Russian forces a strong base through which to attack towards Druskivka. But it's important to remember that, as with many other Russian advances and other Russian posturing maneuvers, a lot of the time the objective is simply to divert Ukrainian forces to one area and then attack elsewhere. And in the process, try to grind them down and exploit any gaps that are possible. But if there aren't any gaps, then at least to divert forces from another location where there could be a new gap formed. And so I think that's a part of the consideration over here, but there's also a tactical consideration, which would be to advance at a depth and take over control of regions that are relatively open. Now, I say this because right now there are a lot of forces that are being redeployed from Sumy and Kherson. So, to begin with the ones from Sumy, we have the 177th Naval Infantry Regiment, which came from the Sadki region, which is in the eastern part of the Sumy front. And you have the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, really important unit in the collapse of Kursk, and then the subsequent capture of village after village in Sumy. And since then, it's been sort of on the back foot due to Ukrainian counterattacks. Same thing with the 155th Marine Brigade, similar story. And then from the VDV side of things, the 76th VDV division is partially redeploying, and that includes the 11th Air Assault Brigade. So they're all in the process or have already been deployed to Donetsk, but they're not actually engaging in frontline activity yet. It could take a week or two until they get integrated into the fighting over here. And then the question is, where will they fight? Because there is a possibility that they will be deployed exactly to this location that I was talking about, Rusin Yar, Poltavka, in the direction of Konstantinivka and Druskivka. That's a real possibility. And you look at these four units and look at the sizes of, say, a Russian brigade or Russian regiment, and roughly, I would say that there's about 12 to 13,000 forces in this redeployment package. So you're looking at a massive boost to the Russian garrison over here, and that would give them the offensive potential needed to continue forward, because at this point, a lot of their offensive potential is dissipated due to, first of all, advancing at a rapid pace and in an outstretched manner without many logistical hubs nearby, and then not having to endure the Ukrainian counterattacks and trying to hold them off. And so, yes, they're definitely in need of some level of reprieve. A lot of these units have been fighting over here for months without rotation, and so it's necessary at this point. What it does mean is that there's going to be a weakening of the Sumy front. We've already seen that, and it's a part of why the Ukrainians are on the front foot. But it does mean that a lot of the fighting over there will become positional in nature. The Russian objectives will be less maximalist. At least for now, it could change in the future, but in the short term, I don't really see much going on in Sumy in terms of like significant Russian advances. But the one silver lining could be that in turn the Ukrainians will redirect their forces from Sumy, which is something we've already seen them do to a certain degree. I talked about it in my last video. And then maybe there will be a bit of an equilibrium, and then the remaining Russian forces, once the situation stabilizes, can try to reverse some of the Ukrainian counterattacks. But it's not going to be at any significant level. I don't think they're going to reach the second line of villages that we've always been talking about over there. But what is interesting is that a attack over here between Konstantinivka and the Toretsk River could redirect nearby Ukrainian forces and thereby create the necessary conditions in order to fully close the lid on Pokrovsk. So that's also a possibility within all of this sort of maneuver that I'm theorizing about. And I should obviously preface the fact that this is all just my own speculation about where the forces can be redeployed, but they are certainly being redeployed, and that's a big deal for this part of the front line. So keep an eye out for their movements over the next couple of weeks. And then once we see them integrated, that's when we can expect some changes to the front line, more so than what we're seeing now. Looking at what's going on over here, I just want to mention one last thing. Sorry, I forgot. The 78th Motor Rifle Division is being redeployed from Kherson, where it's been a staple of the Kherson front, to Bakhmut. And the fact that it's being redeployed to Bakhmut indicates that perhaps the unit will disperse some forces to Seversk and then also some to the Chasiv Yar front in the direction of Konstantinivka. So again, this unit is not necessarily the highest caliber, but it is still necessary manpower. And so Russian divisions spent from 12 to 24,000. So I don't know. It's probably on the lower end, if I'm being honest, within the range of 12,000 to 15,000. But nonetheless, it is still a large boost of Russian forces that can be used and redeployed to engage in some of the key battles that the Russians would have preferred to have sort of succeeded in taking over when we're looking at like major population centers. And now they can try to do so with sort of a boost coming in. But when I look at the Toretsk front, that's not necessarily related. I want to zoom in over here on what's going on around Klebanbek, because it appears as if the pocket has not fallen yet. The Russian forces are certainly in control of Kateryivka, and the 68th Tank Regiment is trying to push into Klebanbek itself. And this rail station to the east of Klebanbek has been taken over by the Russian side based on a video from August 21st of the 2nd Battalion of the Presidential Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto Russian positions as they're advancing. The Matrona Rhine mine remains a gray zone, but it is an important a hallmark of Ukrainian defense and is something that allows them to basically outstretch their forces all the way southwestwards from the Toretsk River, about 5 kilometers or 4.5 kilometers southeastwards in this case, and still harass the northwestern outskirts of Toretsk along this mine, along the warehouses. This is a very important outlet for the Ukrainians because, first of all, it tries to disrupt the organization points that the Russians have in Toretsk, and then it also acts as a distraction and diverts Russian attention away from closing the Kalmabik pocket in its entirety. But at the same time, the Russians continued advancing along narrow corridors, and in this case, captured zero point 0.5 square kilometers of territory. Let's look at the horizontal advance. It's about 1.7 kilometers westwards. And this video is from August 22nd. It's from the Predator Police Brigade of FPV strikes onto Russian infantry as they were approaching the rail line and the adjacent windbreak and tried to reach the reservoir itself. So right now, the Russians are about 1.2 kilometers away from cutting off the Klababik reservoir itself, but it's not been done yet. Now, to finish off with the Lyman and Kupyansk fronts, I want to zoom in on what's going on over here in Zaporizhzhia. The Russian forces have been able to expand their footprint to the west of the Zherbets River and capture zero point 0.9 square kilometers of territory. Looking at the westward advance, it's about 1 kilometer, and this geolocation from August 27th shows the 63rd Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto houses where the Russians were situated. So now there is a process going on to just individually clear out houses, and the 63rd Brigade is involved in most of the efforts of resistance, either through tanks or FPVs over here. But this is all with the intention of relegating the fighting to Zaporizhzhia rather than it then blossoming through this paved road and through just a large span of open area, open fields, and a lot of forested areas as well that can be taken advantage of via DRGs, and then arrive at the eastern outskirts of Lyman. So that's why the 63rd Brigade is tasked right now with heavy defensive work in Zaporizhzhia. Moreover, and this is the really significant advance of the day, the Russian forces are closing in on Lyman from the north. So they captured Kolodiazi, and that indicates that there was an advance of about 2.6 kilometers, square kilometers. And in terms of the southwards advance, it's about 2 kilometers to the south. So the entirety of the village has fallen, and now the Russians are trying to sort of control over some nearby forested patches, and they're getting pretty close to the outer ring of defenses that's supposed to defend Lyman from Dorobisheve all the way to the northwestern outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. So this region contains some anti-tank ditches, trenches, and dragon's teeth. And yeah, the Russian forces are only about 1.3 kilometers away. And then from Lyman, they're about, about 8.3 kilometers away. The problem is, this is an expansive area, and the Ukrainian troop deployment over here may not be the most efficient in terms of infantry ground forces. Yes, there are many drone units operating around here that are important for picking off individual Russian soldiers in open areas. But in terms of manning the trenches, manning the tree lines in this region, I don't think the defensive framework for the Ukrainians is sufficient because a lot of forces are tied down in fighting in Chandrikholove or in other vectors of advance. But around Kolodiazi, it's a bit more mute. And then there are others tied down with the Serbryansky Forest or with Zaporizhzhia. So there's a lot of locations where heavy fighting is going on. And that means that there's certainly going to be some holes spotted. And there will be certain locations that can be exploited as a result. So Kolodiazi is just one location where that's possible. But Stavki is right now within the Russian crosshairs as they're getting closer to it. And there are not many paved roads over here, so the Russians would like to get control over some of them and then use them as vectors by which to arrive at Lyman. But where we've seen more focus, and this is something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago when I was just going over the way in which I saw the battles for Lyman unfolding, and this is pretty much unfolding the same way in which I envisaged. The Russian forces are advancing from the northeast towards Chandrikholove and the entire line of villages to the northwest of Lyman. So they captured over here 5.75 square kilometers of territory. And you can see how in the southwestern direction, they were able to push about 5.3 kilometers. So it is a really substantial advance through an open area for the most part. But there are also accompanying tree lines. So that's probably the vector by which the Russians advanced over here. They were not spotted by the Ukrainians in time by their reconnaissance elements. And perhaps the Ukrainians lacked the localized counterattacking force, the rapid reaction force needed from the 60th Brigade in order to push the Russians back. Although it could happen in the future, for the time being, the Russians are in control of this extended salient. which is pretty close to the outskirts of Darilove, about 2 kilometers away. And in Chandruholove, the battle is raging, but the northern flank is strengthened because we have over here the capture of 4.5 square kilometers of territory. In the southwestern direction, it's about 4 kilometers of an advance. Some Russian sources claim that Zaporizhzhia has fallen, but I'm not sure of that. There's no external confirmation of that. But this does mean that there's now going to be a stronger footprint by which the Russians can attack Zaporizhzhia, obviously, but also Chandruholove, which is more important because through this village, they will be able to control the road network, including this one moving southwards, which is called Huchenka. And then from there, they can arrive at Darilove and Lysivka and Drobysheve, and then eventually their goal being Lyman itself. Finishing off, we have over here back and forth for Novoukrainka and Kharkivka. Novoukrainka is now in a gray zone. It's split between both sides. The 3rd Army Corps and also elements of the 10th Army Corps were involved in counterattacks over here. They took it back, but the Russians were also able to push the Ukrainians out of some of the eastern chunks of the village. And so for now, there is, I suppose, a split state. That's the way that I would describe it. In Redeployment, the Ukrainians have a footprint in the northwestern chunk of the village, amounting to 0.7 square kilometers of an advance. This video from the Russian side from August 29th, but it could be older, shows grenade drops onto those Ukrainian forces. And this shows there's been a concerted effort by the 3rd Army Corps to conduct counterattacks over here. And I question the location of the counterattacks, actually, because it would be more understandable if this was in relation to the Lyman advance, if there was an attempt to just halt it in its tracks. But this has not done that. These attacks by the 3rd and 10th Army Corps have not redirected Russian forces away from their advances. In fact, the Russian attacks and advances exacerbated while the Ukrainians counterattacked. So instead of focusing their efforts on defensive activities over here north of Lyman, they've conducted their own attacking escapades in an area that's less strategically significant for either side. Because what's the end game over here? The end game would be Borova, and that's one of the lower Russian objectives on the pecking order. And even over here, the region where the Ukrainians are counterattacking, the distance from Borova is pretty distant in relation to other locations where there's fighting in the direction of Borova. It's about 23 kilometers away. So I just question the logic of the attacks over here. Even though it's not necessarily the most costly because we're talking about small-scale fighting, the commitment of force to this area is not the wisest, in my opinion. Over here, though, the Russians were able to counterattack northeast of Kharkivka and capture 1.8 square kilometers of territory. Kharkivka itself remains under Ukrainian control, but the Russians are trying to bypass it by attacking forested patches to the north, and then from there try to close in and squeeze the Ukrainians out of their forward positions. So we'll see how that goes. Now, to finish off, we have over here this footage from the area north of Borivska Andrivka, amounting to 1.3 square kilometers of territory. The Russians on August 27th from the 10th Army Corps, the 10th Army Corps of the Ukrainian side, they conducted FPV strikes onto a Russian arms depot in a forested patch, and there was a massive explosive yield generated as a result. Now, when it comes to Kupyansk, the Ukrainians have been able to stabilize the situation, and the first stabilization measure occurred around the 8th of August up until around the 15th of August, and that's when they were able to push the Russians out of their positions in Sobolivka, and those were really, difficult days for the Ukrainians because there was a possibility of the road network into Kupyansk being cut off from the west. So the Ukrainians rapidly redeployed forces from the eastern bank and were able to close down this vector of attack and prevent DRGs from fiddling around in this region. But by the 20th of August, there was another attempt by the Russians to attack in the same direction, and this was also later reported on by Deep State, and they reported it after the fact. But the Russians were able to expand their control east of Moskovka and towards the western outskirts of Kupyansk itself. And they were also able to approach Sobolivka once again. But yet again, by the 20th, roughly around that time period, the Ukrainians also were able to conduct a counterattack. And now the proof is coming out because this is from August 29th. 10th Army Corps, yet again, because this is a rather large corps that's already had a lot of troops integrated into it. But it's split. It's split between Kupyansk and the Luhansk fronts. They interacted with locals in Moskovka, and this indicates that at the very least, the Ukrainians took back 4.6 square kilometers during recent weeks, throughout the month of August. And so which unit would have done this specifically? I would assume that it's either the 14th Mechanized Brigade, because they're a part of the 10th Army Corps, or the 116th Mechanized Brigade, which is also nearby and a part of the 10th Army Corps. But what this means is that there's been a stabilization of the front line, no more outstretched Russian salients that can encircle Kupyansk, at least for the time being. But there is still a strong Russian base through which to directly enter into Kupyansk, which is already partially the case. Certain parts of the northwestern chunk of the town have already fallen into Russian hands, and there still remains a strong, again, a Russian network of forces all the way from Kalinova to Komyshuvakha. I know some Ukrainian sources disagree with my marking of the map. Some Ukrainian sources claim that the Russians are partially in control of Komyshuvakha and that there still is a Ukrainian pocket of resistance to the east of the village and also north of Redeployment, which would then mean that the Russian forces in their composition over here would be more tenuous than I'm describing over here with my depiction of the situation, which indicates that the Russian salient north of Kupyansk is very expansive in terms of its width, which means that it's going to be easy to resupply it. So that's up to interpretation, and for the time being, I'm not going to change my marking of the map. And that's all for today. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.